Adventist church background that he had, accept this doctrine of final punishment. He was looking for somebody to research this study for him, who was outside the Adventist movement, who he believed was equipped to do this research, and then supposedly he would decide from that whether he should reject that doctrine as well or not. So that was Brinsmead's path. Meanwhile, I was just moseying along, doing my own thing and trying to behave myself. I was preaching in St. Louis at the time, a few years earlier than when the book came out, and was invited one year by Carl Ketcherside, who was the man in the movie last night, who, by the way, was not connected with that school in any way, and he was there because I had invited him to come during an annual program and speak to a number of students in my dorm room. So I was the one who got him there, I think, in the first place. But anyway, he had invited me to be on a program at St. Louis Christian College, which was an independent Christian church school, on hell. And they would have speakers on two sides of different subjects. And it was not a debate, it was just a presentation. Well, I didn't know much to say on the subject, so I did some research and came up with a paper to give at that conference. The paper, I've always been lazy, and I like to recycle material and get as much use out of it as possible. So I decided to try to redo this paper and send it to Christianity Today. I sent it to F.F. Bruce in England and W. Ward Gask in the United States and asked if they would read it and make comments on it. They did, and I incorporated their suggestions. Then sent it to Christianity Today. Harold Linsell was then editor. He accepted the paper, published it in CT in August of 1976. The article that was published was made into a little tract called Putting Hell in Its Place, which was the name of the Christianity Today article. And this was done by a Church of Christ preacher who agreed with what I was saying. I did not really know a whole lot to say at that time, but I read through this book this morning with Aaron on the way up here, and the little booklet is really pretty darn good. Anyway, I decided that I knew more than I thought I did at the time. And in fact, so much so that I thought to myself, I want to do a couple of things with this morning. First, I want to read you one sentence from about page 5. After talking about punishment in the New Testament, I make the statement, these terms are not one whit too severe, in picturing the just punishment awaiting those who now reject God's deliverance. So we tell Dr. Stackhouse, I beat him to the draw. Second thing I wanted to do is say, if you guys are interested, you can have this put on your website somewhere. And if you or anybody else here is interested in reprinting it as a little tract like that, you're welcome to do that. I'm still lazy and I still like to recycle. Right. So anyway, that happened. Meanwhile, Brinsmead in Australia read this article in Christianity Today, and he decided this fellow was whatever traits he was looking for, enough to do the job, and he offered me the research project. He came to my home in Alabama, where I lived at the time, and we talked for 16 hours and slept a little bit, and I decided to do it. So that's a long answer. When my children were growing up, my son Jeremy here, and my daughter Melanie, who was here last night, well, they would ask me a question. They would, on any subject, they'd frequently preface it by saying, Dad, I have a question, but I don't want to know very much about it.
Well, I got a microphone now. It's all right. That's great. Can you guys hear me okay? Okay. So you told me in an email that you had sensed, although this wasn't an area of interest of particular of yours before this point, you sensed that God had been equipping you for this task. In what ways had he been doing that?
Well, I made some notes when we were talking about these questions. Because I not only am lazy, also forgetful. In fact, I've got a hole in my brain and information frequently falls out. It seemed to me when I was doing this research project that everything in my life had been leading up to this point. Going to Athens Bible School for 12 years, studying the Bible intensely from very early childhood forward, being taught to let the Bible lead wherever it went and to learn from it, not to seek affirmation for my ideas in the Bible. All of that was leading up to this. The academic specifics that I had in life seemed to point this direction, with an emphasis on biblical languages and particularly on Greek. The theological education at Abilene Christian was also pointing this way. Abilene is a wonderful school. I put in a plug for you guys, and I'm so grateful to have been able to go there. I had the privilege of studying patristic Greek under Everett Ferguson and other people there who were experts in their field. I don't know how much more to say about that. I'd been a member of Evangelical Theological Society since 1973, and that was a good background because I had an open door to reach a lot of theologians immediately from my work in that organization. I'd had several articles published in Christianity Today, which gave some credibility. My wife had an uncle in Houston when I was in college who was an old retired, nearly blind Baptist preacher, but he had a lot of books. We came to see him one Thanksgiving, and he said, showed me his library and said, here's a couple of big old books that I don't ever read. I don't know what they are. You can have them if you like. And I said, I like. And it was R.H. Charles' Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha of the Old Testament, which was a major thing for a gift. Another one of my wife's uncles said to me when I started doing some of this work, I want to help you if I can. Here's a check for $100 to go toward a new typewriter. And I got an IBM Selectric with a little ball in it, and that was a great preparation. Access to Vanderbilt Divinity School, which was very close to my wife's parents' home in Franklin, Tennessee, and that was so convenient. It just seemed like everything worked out. And Robert Brinsmead, who you saw last night in the video, that was a great surprise and a wonderful surprise. He was so helpful. I can't think of the nice word to say for what I'm trying to think of. I was not a nice person in one respect because I kept questioning him as to what he really was up to. I've kind of been a suspicious critter, and lots of people, first impression, I don't trust them or I have a bad impression. None of you, of course. But then I learned later that I was wrong. But he was so generous and so open, I couldn't believe it was real until he finally convinced me. But just for example, when I was studying the intertestamental material, I needed to know what the Jewish rabbinical literature had to say. And it happened that the particular volumes that had this Jewish material in it had Strachan Billerbeck is the name of it, had 60 pages in an article on paradise and Gehenna in the rabbinic material, but it was in German, and I could say Ach Himmel, but I didn't know anything else in German except Gesundheit, and then of course I was American. But anyway, brings me to this fellow in Norway who was a native German speaker, and he had paid him to translate these 60 pages and sent them to me. And anything I needed, I'm telling you, you can edit out a lot of this. But he was just so generous. All of that, it just seemed natural. And I look back on it now and I think, wow, I was 35 years old when that started. And now I'm double that. And it's like my whole life has since then been steered by that business almost. And I'm so grateful to the people last night, Rob McRae and others, who said that I was more interested in grace than I was in hell, because I thought how sad it would be if I put on my tombstone the hell man or something.
Right.
Actually, we bought our tombstones already. I've got a picture of it in my camera, standing beside it, and it says, "Asleep in Jesus." which I thought was what I really wanted to say.
Oh, yeah, that's good. Sure.
Edward, you've been talking about how lazy you are. I think we should give you that mic and make Chris hold this one.
All right.
So while he's getting his mic set up, I'll ask my next question.
Thank you, sir.
If Helen, Mr. Fudge, is any indication, you and Sarah Faye encountered some hardships during your research project. In it, if I remember correctly, you're fired from a preaching position, seemingly because you crossed a racial line that recant what you had taught and written concerning God's grace. How did these and other hardships impact your research project? Did they make it more difficult?
Well, they made it. They brought it about in one sense. On the other hand, these were not pleasant experiences. And the movie was. People sometimes say how accurate was the movie to reality, and I like to answer like this: everything in the movie either happened, or something like that happened, or it could have happened. It's kind of like sometimes people ask me about something that's happened, and I'll say, well, this is what happened, and I'll suddenly say, well, either that happened or I thought about it. But anyway, the truth on the firing at the church, this is one of those that something like that happened. We had a revival or something going on, and a black brother, a friend of mine named Jerry Langford, had come to our meeting one night, and I called on him for prayer. So that had happened. The next Sunday, those of you who have rural backgrounds in the deep South will know what I'm talking about. The next Sunday, between Sunday school and church, when it was time for all the men to go out and have one final cigarette, they were gathered on the front porch, smoking. They take one long draw, flip it in the yard, and walk in the building blowing smoke. Call it the Dragon Parade. But anyway, I went to these men, and one of them said, Brother so-and-so is upset with you. And I went to Brother so-and-so and said, I hear you got a problem. He said, yeah, why did you call on that fella for prayer? I said, why not? He said, because they got their own church. They ought to go there. I said, what are you going to do when you get to heaven? He said, well, all I can say is this. If they're going to be there, God better have something else for me. And I was always very tactful, so I said, well, an attitude like that, you don't have to worry about it. When I met with the elders, they said, we think it's time for a change. I said, what's wrong? He said, well, first of all, we've never had a preacher more than 2 years, and you've been here 4. Second place, we're not accusing you of saying it, but some of the members have got the idea that you think the Baptists and Methodists might also go to heaven. And I said, yeah, that's right. But anyway, so that really happened. They did not mention the black brother, but I'm sure that was part of it. The firing at my family's book business happened like it showed it pretty much. And I really did say those exact words to that gentleman. What happened when he basically said, we'll pay for you to denounce the gospel and say what we're saying instead, the only thing I could think of was Simon the Sorcerer. And in the Phillips version, the other guy says, to hell with you and your money. And I thought, I'll quote a little scripture to it. But when I did, his countenance fell in the King James Version. And he went out of the room immediately and came back and said, he didn't come back, his sidekick came back and said, Brother Cogdell, the fellow's name was Roy Cogdell, told me to tell you you're fired. And I said, when? He said, right now. I said, do I get any severance or anything? He said, well, I understand you've got 2 weeks vacation and 1 week pay. And I said, okay. So I gathered up as much stuff as I could carry that I wanted, since it was my dad's business. And I didn't think they had a right to keep it. And I went home, and my wife had just come home 10 days before with our son having been born at the hospital. And she said, what are you doing home so early? I said, I've got good news and bad news. Which do you want to hear first? She said, I guess the good news. So I said, well, the good news is I've got 3 weeks pay in my pocket. The bad news is I don't get any more. But because of it, now I'm coming to your question. when I'm teaching a class, I frequently get off on a trail like this. And then I come to this point and I say, well, we've got 17 minutes left. We're going to finish exactly on time. And we do. So I'm going to finish exactly on time. But what happened, when I got fired from the church, a group of us, including Mark Witt and his wife, had been meeting together one night a week at our house for about a year, reading the Bible, praying, and asking God to do something. And so at this point, I said to these guys, we're free to start meeting with you on Sunday if you'd like. We want to start another little gathering. So we started meeting in a shopping center. Very soon moved to a renovated barn. Had a horse in the pasture outside the door, which is not a good thing if you leave the door open and your hymnals are out, because horses not only destroy what's there, but they leave souvenirs. And so anyway, we were meeting in this barn, and here I got a job after 1 year of unemployment as a typesetter in a print shop. And that was a very good thing in a way, because here I was working in a print shop for people who didn't care what I believed on any subject, going to a church of 30 people who met in a barn called Elm Street Church, and they trusted me, and I loved them. And it was totally free, no pressure from anywhere. It was like God had prepared a place in the wilderness that was safe, and that's when the Brin's Meat came along, and that's when the book was written. And at the time I researched it, I was not a lawyer. Dr. Stackhouse last night mentioned I was a lawyer, and I became one later. But at that time, I was not a lawyer. This was not anything glamorous. I was an unpaid, unofficial pastor of a little church that met in a barn with 30 people and earning a living in a commercial print shop as a typesetter. I decided that God could give me a better job than that, and so my gratitude began to be mixed with discontent. And one day I was driving to work in that little Opel GT, which is the only thing in the movie I really object to. My car was beautiful, it was gold colored, and it didn't look like a piece of junk. But anyway, driving to work one morning telling the Lord my resume and saying, you've given me this, thank you. You gave me that experience, thank you. But where has this gotten me? And as soon as I said that last sentence, I heard a word in my head that said, you've got the question wrong. It's not where has this gotten you, it's have you been faithful with what you've been given. And I said, I think so. I hope so. I'm sorry. I'll try to do better. And so one other quick story, and then we'll get off of that. After 7 years in the print shop of trying to find another job all this time, I finally, through circumstances I won't go into, was hired to move to Houston, Texas, as the founding editor of an interdenominational Christian newspaper. And I moved here and started that paper. And one day the publisher said to me, would you like to have lunch? I said, yes. At lunch he said, would you like to know why we hired you and not the 75 other people who applied for this job? I said, yes, I'd be very interested. He said, because you had typesetting experience, and we thought that might come in handy someday.
That's great. I'm going to ask a couple of questions that came in from the audience. Questions about what you've learned during the course of your research project. How do you explain how the church has been so misguided for so long regarding final punishment? What is the origin of this deceit, if that's what it is? The traditional view of hell, that is.
That question, the origin of it, or why it's so...
Well, yeah, just how do you explain how the traditional view had such a stranglehold on the church for almost, for 1,000 years and longer?
Well, I think the main answer is because we're people and people do dumb things. The more technical answer is because after Tertullian said that Jesus does not mean that God will destroy the soul, because we know that souls are immortal and cannot be destroyed. After Tertullian said that, Origen comes along about 100 years later and says, but God doesn't do anything without a good reason, so the punishment in hell must be for educational purposes, and eventually those people may get out. He suggested that. He didn't teach it as such. Clement also suggested the same thing. Then when Origen said that, you go another 100 years or so to about 400, Augustine comes along, and he says, I agree with Tertullian, basically. And he refers to Origen and his followers as our party of the more pitiful part. In other words, these are soft-hearted guys who let everybody go to heaven. And so Augustine endorsed eternal torment. When he did that, that basically made it official Catholic doctrine for practical purposes, and that became the doctrine from then on. After Augustine did that, then you have later years, 600 years later, or 700, Anselm, Archbishop of Canterbury, and he adds to the whole mix. He's the one that made up all this stuff about infinite sin against infinite God requires infinite punishment. There are a lot of things wrong with that. I hope you'll get a question on that someday. But Anselm did that. Then Aquinas comes along a couple hundred years later. He adds some more details to the whole mix. And it evolves gradually to the Reformation. Luther begins to question the immortality of the soul. The Anabaptists are teaching, some of them, teaching that man is mortal and that the wicked perish in hell and truly die and are destroyed. Calvin was very firm in the Catholic traditional view. So Calvin's first theological book was a book called Psychopanachia, which means if you can spell it, you earn an A in that class. But the word means the soul stays awake all night long. And it was a book against the Anabaptist, and he was affirming the Catholic tradition. He says very, very nice things in there like this. The cursed Catabaptists, whose very name is to damn anything they say, have lately spewed forth from the pits of hell this noxious teaching, and so on. Well, when he did that, Luther was beginning to question the immortality of the soul. And Luther made a statement like this in typical Lutheran vernacular and finesse. He said the philosophical proofs for the immortality of the soul belong on the great dung heap of Roman decretals. And when Calvin came out with his book so hard against the teaching, some of his buddies came to him and said, "Hey, Cal, Luther's kind of saying some of this stuff. You need to tone it down." So he wrote a new foreword to his book and said, "There are some good men who say this, not from malice, but for lack of information." Anyway, so what that left was the Catholics and Calvin affirming the Catholic tradition of eternal torment. Luther got quiet because he didn't want to split the Reformation over what he considered a minor point. And the Anabaptists are the ones saying what we say, and everybody's drowning them. So that's the way it landed. When the Protestants fled England under Bloody Mary, many of them went to Switzerland, and there they became indoctrinated with Calvin's teaching. There was a Swiss of confession of faith called the Second Helvetic Confession, 1580s, I think, something like that, 1550s maybe, by Heinrich Bullinger, and he taught the immortality of the soul and the eternal punishment of the wicked in his confession of faith. When they came back to England after it was safe to do so, they brought that with them. That became a basis for the later Westminster Confession and became part of Protestant tradition. So if that's too long an answer to your question.
That's good. What is this is kind of an interesting question. What do you, based on your research, if you had to say, I mean, we all know that that your book teaches that the biblical support is most in favor of conditional immortality, but if you had to answer the question, which view do you think has better biblical support, eternal torment or universalism, universal reconciliation, which do you think has more going for it in Scripture?
Are you serious?
It's an audience question. I didn't write it.
That's a legitimate question. The answer is conditional immortality. It seems to me that what I was surprised in the research project was that the Old Testament, instead of not saying anything on this subject, had a very great deal to say, and everything it said sounds like total destruction. It has at least 50 Hebrew verbs and at least 75 Hebrew metaphors or figures of speech describing the end of the wicked. They all sound like total destruction. When you get to the New Testament, if you let the Old Testament explain what the words meant originally, they end up teaching total destruction. And the three most common words in the New Testament for the end of the wicked are die, perish, and destroy, which is John's mentioned last night in his talk. Traditionists have to say die means they never die, perish means no one perishes, and destroy means that nothing is ever destroyed, but they go on forever and wish they could be destroyed. It's just amazing. It's hard to believe that good people believe that, but that's where they come. And what happened, well, I got to add this one detail. What happened after this had been tradition for so long, everybody who's out there is hearing this and being taught this, assuming it must be true, begins to read the Bible with this in mind, and they begin to read it, interpreting everything in an opposite, backward way to end up with this belief that they already had. They don't even know that they're doing it. And today you've got seminaries and schools full of churches, full of pastors and professors and others who are good, honest people in many cases, but their whole livelihood and reputation depends on their continuing faithful to their creedal standards. And so without intending to do anything duplicitous or whatever, they reinterpret it all in this best way they can do to rationalize their position, because they have to come out that way, and they don't even realize that they're in this problem many times. Robert Peterson, who's one of the most vocal, prolific authors, Glenn has crossed swords with him in the Journal of Evangelical Theological Society, which I really appreciated the reinforcement in. Robert Peterson is my co-author of 2 Views of Hell from InterVarsity Press. He's a very good man, but he just so mixed up on this. J.I. Packer, one of the finest Christian scholars ever lived anywhere, but he was so blinded by this traditional doctrine of Kendall Harmon, who was at the Edinburgh Conference in 1991 and gave a paper opposing me in my view. Kendall Harmon's a great man, a bright man, but his ultimate conclusion was, he was opposite John Wenham at that conference. He says his ultimate conclusion was Wenham and Fudge are mistaken because they don't honor tradition as highly as they should. I bumped into Peter Gilchrist one time at a meeting, and he was a bishop in the Evangelical Orthodox Church at that time. Later became Antiochian Orthodox. And I said to him, this is what I'm finding, He said, that was settled by the such and such conference so many hundred years ago, there's nothing more to be said. And so when people sometimes ask, what's the hardest argument to answer for traditionalism, I think the hardest argument is when they say, this is what the church has always taught. They're wrong about that, but because they believe it's true, they're not willing to hear something different. Sorry to be so long-winded.
No, it's okay. You know, John Stackhouse last night, he pointed out what he called a deficiency, but not really a deficiency in your book, which was its relentless focus on Scripture and, not as much theology. Well, I've got a question from an audience member that has to do with theology, and it has to do with the most important theology, the theology of the atonement. He wants to know, during your research, have you encountered anyone who struggled with these questions? If Jesus took it on himself to pay the penalty for sin we have earned, and if that penalty is eternal torment in hell, then why is Jesus not being tormented forever in hell? And if he isn't, how can he really be our Savior?
I've probably not come on anyone who is, I don't remember coming on anyone who asked me really to deal with that question with them.
Theology and family. Do you have any advice?
Well, let me add one detail. Jeremy, when the movie was about to be filmed, the casting people advertised for actors and actresses in some Hollywood medium that does that, and they had each character with a little different ad. And the one for me, they said several nice things about the character. Then they said something like he is easily consumed by his own interest, to the neglect of his family, and so on and so on. And so Jeremy sent me that. He found it on the internet, sent it to me, said, what do you think about this, Dad? I wrote him back and said, it's obviously wrong. Go away, I'm busy. To answer the question seriously, I would say the same thing every other mature person here would say, and that is we should not neglect our families for other things. the most important ministry any of us has is for treating our wife and children properly, giving them the attention they need. And to do that and miss on something else is a good trade-off when you look back on it 50 years later.
Yeah. Well, so let's fast forward to the initial publication of The Fire That Consumes. Your original publisher, from what I understand, only did one printing, and I'm sure that those initial copies were snatched up quickly, and I'm sure that demand only grew. So how is it that the book stayed alive?
We had just moved to Houston, Texas in 1982 when the book came out. Brinsmead wrote me and said, I don't want to be a book publisher anymore. You can have the book and the rights to it, do with it as you please. But he said, the only thing I ask is if you reprint it, do as good a job as I did in the first edition. So I was waiting to get it reprinted, had no money. It was going to cost $10,000 to print a couple thousand books. So I went to the elders of our church here, Berrien Drive Church of Christ, where we've been for 32 years. We had just joined. I said to them, I'm not asking for money. I'm asking for ideas. Does anybody know how I might get the money? And two of the men who I'd hoped might be here, but they both had other reasons they couldn't, named Dwayne Evans and Fielding Fromberg, spoke up and said, well, we don't even know if we agree with what you're saying, but we believe in Christian scholarship. So we will co-sign a note with you at the bank for this printing. And so I did that, and the book was printed. About that same time, I got a letter from a man who said, I'm the editor of Evangelical Book Club. I would like to use your book as a selection, alternative selection. Would you be agreeable? Duh. So, yes, I was agreeable. And about that time, I began to be invited places to speak. Some of them were very small denominations with strange names. And I came back one time, and Dr. Lynn Mitchell, who commented last night, said to me, I declare, Fudge, you're going to be the first bishop of all the weird little churches. Well, it turned out the weird little churches had a lot of nice people in them, and I was very glad to get acquainted with a number of them. But that's the way that happened. Yes,
okay.
Sir.
Now, before running out of time, and I want to make sure that you have an opportunity to do this, I understand that there are a number of people here, and some who aren't, that contributed in some special way or another to the research and to the first edition of The Fire That Consumes. Do you want to say a word or two in recognition of that?
Thank you for the opportunity to do that. I do want to mention several people. My wife, Sarah Faye, I don't know if she's still here or not. She's supposed to be here later for lunch, but she's getting ready for lunch on Sunday, some of you. She certainly contributed, even sometimes unwillingly, but she did in a good spirit. My daughter and son contributed without knowing it by being ignored by me. I think one of the most poignant parts of the movie was when the little girl comes in and puts my hand back on the storybook when I wander off to my own stuff. Certainly appreciate their contribution. Paternoster and John Wenham had a part in the second edition. I'll save that for just a minute. But those were people in the first. Mark and Phyllis Witt were important. Joey Curtis and his wife Vicki. Neil Punt, who is here. Charles Prince, who's not here. Dr. Lynn Mitchell, who's here. Pat Schrader, whose husband Alec is here. Mike Clemens from Alaska, who is here. Benjamin and Susan Fudge, my brother from California, and his wife. Paul Fudge from Florida, his wife. These all had different contributions to it. Neil Punt's book, Unconditional Good News, came out just before I was starting this project, and it was a great encouragement to me. Dr. Lynn Mitchell, when we moved to Houston, welcomed me to the church and got me involved in the teaching program, introduced me to Church of Christ scholars, or introduced my book to them, was probably the first reviewer of it, and was a big promoter of it. Pat Schrader, Alec's wife, was a design artist. She did the cover for the second edition, I believe at no charge, as I recall. When it was time for the third edition, 30 years later, Aaron Fudge, my nephew from California, said to me, Uncle Edward, your book is good, but it's 30 years old and out of date. You need to make a new edition. And with that urging, I did begin to do that. Mark Lanier, who was here last night, who is our host, has been so generous to me through the 16 years I've worked with him. He had come to me about 7 years ago and said at the beginning of the year when it was time to learn your new position and the raise and all that, he started out by saying, Edward, you're 63 years old and you have Parkinson's. There may be things you'd like to do besides practice law. And I'm thinking, where is this going? And then he said, so what I want you to do is this. For the next several years, do as much or little law as you feel like. Teach, preach, and write books, and I'll pay you the same. So, and then I must mention Robin Perry, the editor with Whitf and Stock. I thought to myself, I need to find a publisher for this third edition who will keep it in stock and who will try to make it available to people who are interested. And I'd come to respect Whitf and Stock's name considerably. So I wrote them a generic email just to their general email address. Said, I'm Edward Fudge, I have this book, told them a little bit about it, and would you be interested in possibly doing a new edition? I got back an immediate reply from Robin Perry, who said, we know who you are, we're familiar with your book. He said, I used to be the head of Paternoster Press in England. They did the second edition. And he said, we'd love to have it, and we'll be in touch very soon. And they did, and Robin was a great editor, and that helped. Craig Churchill, the librarian at Abilene Christian, was such enormous help. Richard Balcom was unbelievably generous and open to me, as always had been other writers of forwards, F.F. Bruce and John Wenham. The second edition happened, I'll end with this. Well, I've got to say a word about the third first. The third edition also included the help of my friend Mike Clemens from Alaska, who read every chapter of the third edition and made comments, and also did the index of scriptures for a great part of the book. I had some help from others on that as well. If I miss anybody, I really apologize. Mark Witt, I started saying a while ago, had read the first draft of every chapter. He was my Aaron and her companion who lifted up my hands throughout that whole project. Was in a little barn church with us. Joey Curtis lived down the street from me, and he read every chapter when it first came out as well. So just so many people from all over helped so much. Have I got 2 minutes I can take it long? The second edition came about in this wise, to be biblical in my phraseology. I got a call one day from Paternoster Press, and they said, actually from InterVarsity Press, they said Paternoster had contacted John Wenham at Oxford and asked him if he would write a book on defending conditional immortality. They said to InterVarsity, will you do it with us? InterVarsity said, we've already got our name on several books of this sort. We don't want to get too much typecast just with that view, but we would be interested in a two views book. So out of that conversation came the Paternoster British edition. Basically, they shortened the book and they misspelled lots of words. And that was the second British edition. And then the InterVarsity did two views of hell, and they asked me who should we get for the other view, and I suggested a fellow who had written an article in a magazine, and they asked him. He signed up for it. About 2 years later, he hadn't started, and he said, I'm too busy, I'm sorry I wasted your time. They said, who's next? I said, Kendall Harmon, and they tried him. He said, I don't want to write on this subject. I want to spend my time opposing universalism. They said, who's next? I said, Robert Peterson. So they asked him, and he did. And I think I suggested, for the first time I had seen it, the terms conditionalist and traditionalist as two viewpoints. I may have read that somewhere else, but I don't remember if I did. I think perhaps I thought of those terms and used them in print for the first time. But anyway, Peterson said, I don't like being called a traditionalist. That sounds like I'm doing this because it's a tradition. I said, well, I think you are. And He said, I don't like it. And InterVarsity talked about it and thought about it, and they said, we'll go with Fudge's suggestion. So anyway, that's the way it happened. And Brother Peterson, we had called a traditionalist. Amen to that.
All right. Yeah. Well, we had a number of other questions from the audience, but we're out of time. I also had a number of other questions. But we've just really appreciated the interview, appreciated your time. Let's everybody give Edward Fudge a round of applause. So now we're going to take a 30-minute break. The editors of Rethinking Hell, Greg, Josh, and I, as well as the contributors Peter and Glenn, will be in the dining hall to sign copies if you're interested. You'll also have time to browse the Whipped and Stock and Rethinking Hell book tables if you'd like to look at the books. And also, it's really important. Again, I mentioned this yesterday, but just so you don't forget, there is the exhibit in the library that's going to be taken down this afternoon with a bunch of material of Edward's. So please do check that out. And specifically, it's got a manuscript of the first edition of The Fire That Consumes. It's got a selection of pamphlets by Edward Fudge, except for this one that I've got in my hand. It's got a collection of reviews, clippings, and articles from Edward's personal memorabilia, as well as correspondence between Edward and authors such as John Wenham, F.F. Bruce, Clark Pinnock, and others. That's in the main hall. It'll be here until 2 p.m. And I just want to say a thanks to Chris Berryhill, who is the professional curator who put together the exhibit. She did an incredible job. And with that, we'll see you in a half hour. Make sure to be at your breakout locations. They're listed in your program at 11 o'clock. We'll see you then.
Chris, can you give me a hand, please?
Yes, sure.